All right. Okay, that's so what we're going to talk about, right? And what this is going to be, it's going to be a series of presentations and lectures based around profiling our players, okay? So what we're going to do for the very first one, because it would be too exhaustive of a lecture to go through jumps profiling, strength profiling, aerobics, speed repeatability, fatigue index. If we were to try to do all that on the one lecture, it would be just too bulky and time consuming. So what I'm going to speak about today is profiling, okay? And then we're going to work on individual tangents over the next couple of weeks so I can give a breakdown on jumps profiling and aerobic capacity profiling and what we can derive and what decisions or interventions that we can come from that as well, right? So I remember seeing this slide. I forget where I seen it, but I seen this at a presentation one time based around monitoring, and it just kind of, I suppose, paints a picture in terms of what an awful lot of coaches end up doing with profiling, right? So what we end up doing is the start of the year, we'll do some form of battery of tests, right? We'll collect as much data and information as we possibly can, all right? And then we store it and we'll try and think about what we're going to do with it over the course of the year, okay? And I think that we end up with a tremendous amount of data and information, but what we actually end up throwing out of that is quite minimal at the end of the day. And I suppose the first thing we got to think about is, okay, exactly what and why are we collecting? All right. So if we're trying to, for example, if we decide to put an FMS in our profiling, right? So we think that the functional movement screen is something that we should be adding to our profiling, then we have to ask ourselves, right, why are we doing it? Because, most of our models of injury or the data we have is retrospective. So we're looking back at things that happened, so it's very hard to predict injuries. Okay. So therefore, maybe the FMS is going to drive our programming and our exercise selection and so forth. Okay. So I think we have to have a real definite understanding of what we're collecting, why we're collecting it, and in what area or what capacity or what skill we're going to use to develop based off the information we've collected. And I think that I'd always prefer to break it down, and that's what I actually do at the moment when I'm profiling. I actually don't do a whole lot. I will do what I need at that particular time and profile continuously throughout the year instead of have a tremendous amount of profiling at the start of the year and then put that to bed. Okay. So I think it's like I actually always think of the pinky in the brain with this. It's like, what are we going to do today? We're going to take over the world, and it's very much like this Groundhog Day when it comes to profiling, right? We're kind of thinking on right, what are we going to do in January? We'll do some bit of aerobic capacity. We'll do some bit of strength testing. We'll do some bit of anthropometric slash musculoskeletal testing, and we'll see what we're going to do with it then after that, right? But again, as I've said already, what does all that data mean and how can we use it? That's what these are the questions that we really need to be answering, right? And then we got to look at things from a manager standpoint, right? And, you know, all the manager really wants to know is how does the stuff you're giving me now influence the decisions I'm going to make in the next day or the next week or two, right? The manager generally won't look at a long-term plan. He's not really gonna have a look at, where you're going to be able to get someone in 2 years. And generally speaking, the profiling that you're doing isn't based around what we're looking at in 2 years' time. It's about picking the low-hanging fruit. Okay. So we're deciding what picture do we want to paint about the athlete. Okay. And in order to do that, we have to have a clear understanding of the sport, the demands of the sport, the match play demands of the sport, the biomechanical demands of the sport, the physiological demands of the sport, the demands of the position and the player within the sport, okay? And then how you want to play the sport, okay? So there's a lot in that, right? And I'll give you an example. So if we're looking at a Gaelic football team, right? And we think, okay, how we want to play is we want our two half-backs attacking from deep. So we know that we're going to have a tremendous amount of high speed running with our halfbacks, okay? then if we want him attacking from at speed, then that's going to be more than 17 kilometers an hour. So now we know that that high speed running, the high speed demands of over 17 kilometers an hour on our 5 and our 7, or the two players that we want to play in this position, are going to be really, really high. So we know that they're going to have really good eccentric hamstring strength to tolerate the loads of that high speed running. So it is imperative that we do some form of profiling around testing their eccentric hamstring strength based off the positional demands and how we're playing the game. Okay, so we're starting to paint a bigger picture of what we want to discover, or what we want to outline, and how we want to program and profile for that athlete. Okay, and then how do we use it? All right, so some people will use profiling as motivation. I've often been in a scenario where a manager has asked me to do body fats of players that both he and I knew were tremendously out of shape when it comes to a body fat perspective. So all he wanted to do in that case was use it as a motivational tool. And so he had some numbers and figures and some data which just backed up what we subjectively saw. Okay. And then you can go to the player and you can say, look, this is where you are now. We're going to make an intervention. We're going to do your body fats every 2 weeks, and we're going to give you objective, measurable targets over the next 8 weeks. And then your profiling becomes usable and it becomes relevant as well. And especially if you can back it up with some normative data from what we have in research. So staying with that lad who's, let's just say, at 22% body fat, and we want to get him down to 16 to 18% body fat, then we can go to him and we can say, look, based off the position you play and the sport we're trying to play here, you need to be at an 18, because all the research would suggest that injury rates are higher when you're above 18, that fat doesn't fly. So when we look at the formulas for most of our fitness metrics, like take VO2 max, it's per kilo of body weight. So therefore, we know that if you can drop kilos of body weight, then as a byproduct of that, you're going to increase your VO2 max. So then we can start to motivate using the data and the profiling that we've created on that player, and it's becoming usable. And that's what I would regard as being real world profiling, not necessarily just a load of numbers that we have on a piece of paper because we're just doing it because everyone else does it in January, right? So this is a fantastic book by Thomas Kurtz. If you haven't read it, it's Science of Sports Training, How to Plan and Control for Peak Performance. Really good textbook. And when we're thinking about where we start, then, and just talking to John before we went live on this, right? You're spot on, John. You started from the end point and worked back, right? So this book is just teaching us on how to go backwards efficiently, right? So we start with the end in mind when it comes to this, right? And if we want to get to a player to a certain level of capacity, then we start to see where they are at this current time, and then we try and build to that end point. So we need to know where we want to get to, and you need to know where you are, okay? So on this slide here, okay, we'll see that it's not an exhaustive needs analysis, but it's just a little bit of a needs analysis on intercounty Gaelic football, right? So we can see we have positions here. We have fullback, we've halfback, we've midfield, we've half forward, and we've full forward lines, right? You can see that we have physiological demands, biomechanical demands, and we have normative data as well, right? We also have injury history and how we play the game as well, right? Now, I don't have them put in there because they'll be very much individual and based around the individual athlete and the team's style of play, okay? So we know, right, that if, you're playing in the full back line, you're going to be looking at a distance of about 7.5 to 8K a match. You're going to have a high speed distance of in around 1300 meters. That's anything over 17 kilometers an hour. Then you're going to have a sprint distance, which is anything over 22 kilometers an hour of 381. You're going to have a lot of accelerations, right? And at the VO2 max at Division 1 intercounty level with these players is about 56.8, right? So we now know what the physiological demands are based off the data and the research that's out there. So we have an idea what it takes from a physiological standpoint to play that position. And when we branch that down along for each position, we can now start to paint a little bit of a picture for our players, right? And we know that midfielders have the highest workloads, right? So they have the highest total distance, they have the highest high speed distances, they have the highest number of accelerations. And think of it this way: if you accelerate, you have to decelerate. When you decelerate, you have eccentric loading, you have braking forces, and most non-contact injuries will happen under eccentric load, okay? So we know that they have to be highly robust, that they have to be highly fatigue resistant, right? And we also know that their sprint distance is up on 450 to 500 meters, which is 22 kilometers an hour. So we know that, sorry, they also have the highest VO2 max, but you would have guessed that through the other data there anyway. But my point is that we know that midfielders have to be robust, fit athletes, okay? So if you have a player when you're building a profile, and if the goal for the manager is for this player to play this position, then we know, okay, well, we need to kind of point our profiling towards these metrics here from a physiological standpoint, okay? We know that our half forward line and our half back line will have the highest sprint distances, and we know that our full forward line and our full back line will have the most change of direction, simply because your corner forward, your full forward is going to be trying to create separation, get away from his man. So then something like a limb symmetry index, so how symmetrical is your left leg to your right leg, that becomes something of a material importance for an inside back or an inside forward, based off the fact that there's so many change of direction, okay? So there we're starting to kind of get an idea of what the physiological demands are. And whatever sport you're involved in, lads, I would urge you to have a needs analysis based off the research. Okay, it's really, really important. Doesn't have to look like this. Okay, this was just something that I pulled out last year, right? And I gave back to the players because players like data and they like numbers. It was off Division One football, and it was a recent enough study from, I think it was Shane Malone out of I think Tala. But anyway, then we know the biomechanical demands that we need eccentric hamstring strength. Okay, and when we look at the normative data for injuries in Gaelic football, 70% of the injuries are lower body, right? So we know that a tremendous amount of them, 33% of them, actually are hamstring injuries. So now we know that, okay, like 33% of our injuries are hamstring injuries. These are the running distances that we need to achieve. Then we need to profile the athlete based around hamstring strength. It's so important. And then we set a standard, we set a metric, right, based off what we pull out of the research as well. And we give the players something very pointed and something very specific for them to try to achieve, because that is what I would call a KPI, a key performance indicator, okay? We know that body fat between 12 and 15% for an intercounty Gaelic footballer. If you're over 15%, it's actually, if I was involved with a club team tomorrow morning, that's the area that I would see as being the biggest area of improvement for 90% of players. If you're over 15% of body fat, there you go. You're going to be slower. You're not going to be as fit. Your strength to weight ratio is not going to be as good. Your chance of injury is going to be higher. So the fastest way to make so many gains with a player is to get him below 15% body fat while you maintain muscle mass, and irrespective of anything. So therefore, anthropometrics become really important. Body fat percentage becomes really important. And you can tell by looking at someone anyway, right? And the thing about it is, someone can walk around at 20% for a male and actually look reasonably lean. But in order to compete, as I've said already, fat doesn't fly. And if you want to be fast, then if you look at like Newton's laws, so what's force, it's mass times acceleration. So you'll find that it comes back to every one of these formulas, okay? So we have our needs analysis, right? Then if we look at the left of this, right, we have our existing performance. So that's where we have our profile, okay? So where are we currently, right? And what's our required outcome? So this is where we are, this is where we need to go. And then that area in the middle is a gap analysis, right? How do I fill this gap? What intervention do I make here so that we can bridge the gap between where we currently exist and where we're required to get to? So if I have a player who has X amount of hamstring tears and my manager is telling me that he wants to play him in a certain position, and I know that I need to expose him to X amount of loading, whether it be through maximal sprinting, whether it be through eccentric hamstring lengthening, through Nordics or RDLs or whatever it is, but I need to expose him enough to make him robust enough so that he can withstand the demands of the sport based on what the manager wants and where the current situation where the player is. Okay, so we need to know where we are, we need to know where we need to get to, and we need to know where we are, and then we close that gap with a gap analysis. So there are so many different types of testing you can do, all right? So you can call it profiling, you can call it athletic ability assessment, whatever it is, right? Now, I think it's important that I outline this from the start. There are issues here, okay? First one is time, all right? You're going to have 30 players, okay? You're probably going to have a Saturday to try and test them all, okay? And all of a sudden, there's so much you could do, but practically speaking, there's only X amount that you can do, right? So therefore, it's really important that we're prudent with the choices of screens that we do, right? Secondly is resources. People mightn't have jump mats. People mightn't have push bands. People mightn't have even calipers, right? You mightn't even have a field. You could be locked out of your field in January because it's rained so much, okay? You mightn't have a squat rack. There's so many resources that might be limiting what you can do as well, right? So I appreciate that, all right? I really do. However, my point here is you look at what the sport requires for the athlete and then you pick the low hanging fruit, okay? What I currently do is I will do what I call ready to train profiling, all right? And within that ready to train profiling, what I'm looking for is tissue capacity. So I will have a bridge test. So it's a 40 centimeter box. It's a maximal effort single leg bridge with the knee at 20 degrees of flexion. I'll ask them to bridge up with both legs first. I'll get a mark of their hip. And I'm looking for 30 off the left leg, 30 off the right leg. If they're hitting 30, 30, they get a green light for me, and that's their ready to train standard, right? If they're not hitting that, so if they're between 25 and 30, that's, that's my ready to win standard. 30, 30 is ready to win. Between 25 and 30 is ready to train. If you're less than 25, you're not ready. And at that point, you shouldn't be exposing yourself to the high speed demands of what you're going to be doing to play the sport, right? So therefore, that's the low hanging fruit for that person. Grind squeeze is the next one. So I'm looking at 45 degrees, 0 degrees, and 90 degrees of flexion, all right? I'm looking at a single leg hop test for calf capacity and calf function. I'm looking at shoulder flexion, thoracic extension, right? And I'm looking for limb symmetry index off a jump mat. And with those 5 metrics, I'm going to get an idea of what the quality of tissue capacity is for this player to be able to do the aerobic capacity test that I will be asking that player to do in 4 to 6 week time. I want to make sure that he has that done first before I ever put him into an aerobic capacity test. Because to me, that becomes before that, right? So I will do that and I will do a jumps profile. And the reason I do a jumps profile is because I want to see how mechanically the person produces force, right? So what's their eccentric utilization ratio? So I'll do a coordination ratio. And I'll go into this next week or the week after when I'm laying all these out, because we'll speak 30 minutes on just the jumps profiling alone. But my point is, and I'll speak on my level 1 tissue capacity profiling on separate lectures. But my point is that I will have a sequence in terms of what I'm asking the player to do in terms of the profiling, right? Now, You can do a musculoskeletal screen, right? You can do tissue capacity, jumps profile, aerobic capacity, strength testing, linear and multi-directional speed. You can look at things like sprint repeatability and like the Fitzsimons fatigue index, right? We're also looking at things like injury history, training age, lifestyle. You could go down the lines of doing personality profiling, which is really, really important as well. Um, Anthropometrics, body fats, really, really important. And these are all the things that some people will try and do in a day. And I firmly believe, right, that it is next to impossible to do these in a day with a group of athletes, right? Because, and I'll explain why in a few minutes, but the point is that to me, I will have a sequence of how I want the athlete to perform throughout the year. And I will have a hierarchy of what's important based on that time of year. So if I know that they're coming into preseason in January, I want to make sure that I'm going to get the tissue capacity done in November so that they have 4 to 6 weeks of building capacity in their hamstrings, their Achilles, their calves, their hips, so that once they do hit the field, we can then push them without breaking them, right? Uh, and here I put a picture of like a high board diver, okay? Because the profiling you do with a high board diver wouldn't look completely different to the profiling you do with a Gaelic footballer, right? Because the demands of the sport are completely different. So if we look at the high board diver, see how quickly he has to tuck and pike. So segmental flexion is really important, okay, for that person. Triple extension isn't going to be as important. However, triple extension is really important for a Gaelic footballer for acceleration and jumping, whereas it's not going to be as important for a diver. So therefore, the profile, as I've said already, is going to look different from sport to sport. So that's why having the needs analysis done, which is what I spoke about a couple of minutes ago on the previous slide, becomes a material consideration for you, okay? Then once you have that, you can start breaking this down in any way at all. But this is like a little flow chart here, okay? So let's just say the performance goal is to increase speed, all right? Then we look at the required physical capacities to increase speed. So we have maximal strength, we have rate of force production, we have fast stretch shortening cycle, acceleration, maximum velocities or maximal speed, limb symmetry, and trunk control. Out of every one of them, we have tests. So if we're looking at maximal strength, we're looking for a 1 to 3 1 RM. If we're looking for rate of force production, we could be looking at a squat jump or a counter movement jump. If we're looking at the fast stress shortening cycle, we could look at the reactive strength index, looking for acceleration, 5 to 10 meter sprints, max speed, 60s, and so forth. And then we can start selecting our exercises based off the gap that we see in the athlete's performance down through those tests. Okay, so I hope this is kind of shining a little bit of a light, right, on how we would lay this out on a bigger, on a simpler scale for an athlete. Okay, so we have this procedure, right, because the two things that we need to have when it comes to testing are reliability and validity. Okay, so number one, how reliable is the test we're doing, and number two, how valid is the test we're doing, right? So if we test someone on a Sunday morning and we decide to do like a 30-15 intermittent running test, and we do it on AstroTurf in January, okay? Or sorry, we do it on the ground, right? The field in January. It's going to be wet, it's going to be heavy, it's going to be soggy, right? And we test them, we derive some kind of a profile, we design an intervention, that'll come in the form of a program, we retest them in 8 weeks. And when we retest them, we now retest them at let's just say 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening on AstroTurf. Then the environmental conditions are going to be completely different because one of them we're doing it in the morning, the other one we do it in the evening. Then we're doing them in two different surfaces, right? So all these are going to affect the reliability of the test that you're doing, right? On top of that, you're going to have an order of how you do it, okay? So generally speaking, all right, when someone comes in, okay, you get an idea what their health history is, right? Where is the site for if you were to predict an injury, where would the site be? It would nearly always be the site of a previous injury. Okay. So you gotta ask these questions, right? And you start to paint a little bit of a picture. Then you do your resting measures first. So if you want to do your body composition, if you want to do your like grip handheld dynamometer testing, whatever it is, right? All your resting measures come first, okay? Then you would move into your submaximal cardiovascular tests, then your test for agility, power strength tests, sprints tests, local muscular endurance tests, anaerobic capacity tests. That would be the sequence. However, I feel that when you do that, okay, you will have an interference effect, okay? So now at the moment, all I would do is this. My level 1 testing, someone comes in, I will do our resting work, they will go on the bike, they will do 2 minutes on the bike with an RPE of 4 out of 10. They will do their jumps testing with 30 seconds between jumps, and from there they will do the muscular endurance testing. So I will go resting measures, warm up, jumps, so I'm going power first, and then I finish with muscular endurance testing. And I keep that all the time, the same sequence. I will try to test people at the same time so that we're affecting just rhythms. Okay, like I know that if I held a grip dynamometer and if I test my grip at 8 o'clock in the morning, it's not going to be the same score as it is at 8 o'clock in the evening. I'm always stronger in the evening, right? So therefore, I'll try and test around the same times all the time so that I can adhere to validity. And if we don't do that, we get what I would recall a blender effect, where we get all these tests, we throw them into a sequence, right? And then we don't really know what we're coming out with, right? Because everything is blended into everything else. And we have too much interference. We have too much just we're asking too much of the athlete in a short period of time, right? And when we try to get our hands around everything, we actually end up with not a whole pile of information from a validity or a reliability standpoint. Okay. So that brings me on to when do we profile, right? Now, I think that generally, right, or traditionally, what would happen would be that people would profile in January, they'd retest again 8 weeks later, and that's it then. And it's done. And we kind of don't consider it for the rest of the year. But to me, subjectively, you're profiling every session. Every single session is an opportunity to profile. It could be just a quantitative movement assessment. How is someone moving on any given day, right? Then if someone looks stiff or tight, or they're not as loose and as rhythmic as they normally are, lie them down. Jesus, your hips stuck tight. I wonder what your internal rotation is like today. Boom, hit him with it. Lie him down and check it, or her. So I think that subjectively, we're profiling all the time, and this is the art of coaching, right? Um, but then objectively, when it comes to jump speed and multi-directional speed, I think that once per quarter is really important, right? So if we're breaking our plan, our annual training plan, I break it into quarters, and I will be looking to profile once per quarter when it comes to jump. And then, of course, when it comes to monitoring, we could be adding jumps in all the time. So if you have a jump mat, and I encourage everyone to buy one because they're not that expensive, you could bring your jump mat to train and you could pick 5 players and you could just look at your counter movement jump, and you could use that as a monitoring tool because it's a really good monitoring tool. And if you're looking for I suppose you're looking for a worthwhile change, and if you see that, okay, this fella is 20% down on where he normally is, then you make an intervention because it's a good indication of fatigue or overtraining. So you pull him back a small bit, right? So you can also use it within that context. Strength, again, you record during training all the time. So when someone is filling out their Excel or their Google Docs or your online app, whatever it is, their numbers are consistent profiling. Is someone getting stronger? Are they getting weaker? What are their lifts looking like? Is the movement getting slower? Right, okay. Their squat is 10 kilos heavier, but it's 3 seconds slower. So, like, if we're sacrificing rate of force production for maximal strength, even though the goal is rate of force production within that block, and we're 4 weeks out from championship, then maybe you need to make an intervention on that one as well, right? And then, of course, like weights used, volumes, tonnage, power, if you do have a push band, these are all, I suppose, subjective, objective profiling measures, monitoring measures that you can be using all the time, right? And again, like what are you getting your 1, your 3, your 5 RMs for? You're getting them so that you can give them a benchmark for which they can select intensities within their program. So you can't ask them to have 60% of the 1RM if they haven't a fucking iota what the 1RM is, right? So that there would be why you would be looking at reevaluating your strength numbers a couple of times throughout the year, okay? Now I have power in there because, again, when we're looking at our jumps profiling, right, and our strength, you can take so much from that, and I'll go deep into this on the jumps profile lecture, but you can take so much of the mechanical properties of how someone produces force off a jumps profile. In many ways, probably get an awful lot more off that than you can off a 1RM back squat, okay? Endurance, again, if you have heart rate monitors or GPS, you're monitoring this all the time, you're recording this all the time, you're creating a profile on the player all the time. Like, for example, if you're GPSing players and you're 4 weeks into the league, then you have a fucking really good idea of how fit someone is, and a far better marker of where someone is from a physiological standpoint in terms of being able to meet match demands than you have off any test. Because remember, the purest form of any test is the sport itself, and sometimes we lose sight of that, right? And then again, 1 per quarter in prep periods. Outside of prep periods, unless you have to make an intervention with someone, then I think that the game looks after an awful lot of that. Anthropometrics, okay, body fat is dependent on the existing body comp of a person, right? If someone is within the range you want them to be at, maybe once per quarter, again, keep an eye on them subjectively. You see fellas in the shower, you see fellas getting togged off, right? An awful lot of the time in season, people lose weight, right? And they start to lose a little bit of muscle mass, and maybe, that's a conversation you need to have with a player. If someone isn't where they need to be, then fortnightly, every 2 weeks, and it's something that you really keep an eye on closely, and you give them some very definite markers and targets. From a metabolic standpoint, I encourage players to keep an eye on the resting heart rate consistently, something that they can do in the mornings. Most players have some form of a Fitbit or I don't know, Apple Watches. They have something that would give them an indication of what the resting heart rate is as well. And again, if you're getting a deviation from the norm on that, it could be a sign of overtraining, could be a sign that you're coming down with a virus or a sickness, or you're immune compromised. So again, it's a good marker in which you can base an intervention off. Then orthopedic, like musculoskeletal profiling, how often and when? It depends, right? So, like, it depends on injuries for starters, okay? Like, something that you're going to work with the physiotherapist. Like, what do I look at? Like multi-segmental flexion, i.e., like the ability to bend over and touch your toes. That's important. It's important for Gaelic football because an awful lot of the sport involves you picking the ball from the floor. Okay, groin squeeze, shoulder range of motion, hamstring eccentric strength, and again, these can all be part of your daily screening, right? So you could have a cuff. You could have a cuff just like this. I just happen to have it here, lads, because I was profiling the other day. You could have your cuff, and you could lie 5 lads down, just get an idea where they are. If you have the resources, you could have an intern with you. You could have your jump mat out. You could have your cuff, and you're rotating players based off the loads that you're seeing off their GPS. So if you have lads who are overloaded on the GPS, pull them in, test them on these things. If they're down a small bit, they're fatigued, and then you adjust their training load accordingly. Then how do we profile, right? So again, I'll go deeper into this, but Z-scores are brilliant. So I don't know how well versed we are in statistics, but a Z-score is essentially how close you are. It's a standardized score based off where you are from the average of the mean, okay? So a Z-score is the athlete score minus the average divided by the standard deviation, okay? Now, the Z-scores are brilliant, and I'm going to show you a working example in a minute, right? Problem with Z-scores is this, right? First of all, if you have a low sample size, right? So if you're working with an individual athlete or a small number of athletes, then you mightn't have the sample size to give you an accurate Z-score. Another one is if all the scores are pretty shit and you have one player who's really who's good, then it throws it out as well, right? So in that case, you can use a benchmark score, all right? So a benchmark score could be a standard that you want the players to try to hit, right? So the formula for that would be the athlete score minus the benchmark score divided by the standard deviation. And again, if you want to go deeper with this, you can work with the technical coaches and you can have a benchmark score in conjunction with them. So you can have a benchmark score off skills, you can have a benchmark score off anything. And that will give you a standardized score in which you could rank players, okay? So this is how I would present my jumps profile back, right? Can you see that, lads? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that, yeah? Cool, all right. So we'll see here, okay, that I have all the players' names here, right? Then you have CMJ as your counter movement jump, your counter movement jump without arms, your squat jump, and that's just your counter movement jump in inches, right? So up here, okay, I have the group, right? So this is the mean for the counter movement jump, the counter movement jump without arms, and the squat jump. Then I have the standard deviation, right? So these are just, you just get these out of Excel, right? They're just formulas, and I'll do a lecture on how to figure all this out, right? So you have your standard deviation of from that, right? Then you get your athlete's raw score, which is down here, right? So you enter the athlete's raw score here, right? And then using the formula that I outlined already, okay, which is the raw score, the mean score, all right, and the standard deviation. So you use those three data points to give you a Z-score, right? And then once you have the Z-score, you can use the percentage formula to give you a percentile rank. So then what that does is, if you look down in this triangle graph here, okay, you can see that it will present the player score back as a percentage of the group score. Okay, so you can see here that this player's counter movement jump, right, was at 55%. Okay, so he was just above average, but his squat jump was at 77%. Okay, squat jump without arms was at 60%. What that does is it allows you to, number one, give them a ranking within the group, right, based off standardizing all their scores, okay? And secondly, what I suppose even more importantly, it gives them a really good indication of where they are between jumps. So you can see that this player's squat jump, he is way up, right? So when we removed the elastic component of his jump, so when I asked him to stop, pause, I count 1, 2, 3, and then ask him to jump, where it's a concentric rate of force production only, this lad is, there's only 23% of the group better than him. However, with the counter movement jump, when I asked him to dip and go, where I want him to use this stress shortening cycle, he's just above average in the group. So then the squat jump by the counter movement jump gives me his eccentric utilization ratio, right? And we can see here that it's 0.99. So this fella's squat jump was actually better than his counter movement jump, which is rare. So most players from an athletic standpoint, when you ask them, to do a squat jump versus a counter movement jump, the counter movement jump is always better. So this fella's concentric rate of force production is really good, but his ability to utilize the stretch shortening cycle isn't good. So therefore, we weight our training towards that capacity. So I want him working on his rate of force production, working on his elastic component and how he uses that elastic component. So we could be looking at pre-tension at the foot. We could be looking at, I'm not saying jump straight into plyometrics, but we could be definitely looking at a faster rate of force production for that athlete, right? So that's how we use ZScores. This is another way. This is just for an individual athlete again. So you can see here that we're looking at January, February, March. We're looking at April and we're looking at August, right? So we can see that the blue line are his April scores and that the red line are his August scores, right? And the standard deviation, right, is this gray line, all right? So remember, a Z-score is just how far he is from the mean, okay? So we can see here, just for example, right, that like his bench press here back in his first test was just around average. But then we really improved and pushed him out here towards the back end of the group. So he's leading that here, okay? But he didn't make such a big jump on his snatch, right? So we just made very mediocre gains on his snatch. So now we know we've improved his bench, okay? We've improved his front squat, we've improved his clean, his posterior core strength, his anterior core strength, his single leg strength, but his snatch was the one that we improved least. So now we just might weight our programming based on other variables now, i.e. like the time of the season and so forth, on something like that, right? And you can see where you have your scores here, and that's how we would use Z-scores to give us like a spider/radar chart and throw something out like that, okay? So then how do we feed it back? And I think that how this is really important actually, right? So how we actually feed the information back to the athlete is important because, you know, some athletes are visual learners, some athletes they will see something and they'll be drawn to it, right? So to me, I like to communicate in three simple ways. You're either ready to win, ready to compete, or you're ready to train, right? So ready to win means that there's no further work needed to improve that capacity, all right? So if you're that, you get a 3. So you score a 3, and that's a green, okay? Ready to compete, so there's a little bit more work required in order to prove that capacity, all right? And in that case, right, you're looking at scoring a 2 and you're on a yellow. And if you're only ready to train, right, there's more work needed. You only get scored a 1, right? And that's a red. So it's a really good way of relaying it back to the athlete and the coach. So the coach says, come here, how's such and such hamstring capacity? Oh yeah, he's only ready to train. You know, he's still in a red. He's not ready for game time yet because he needs to improve this. And he says, fair enough. But if you have a group of players who are all ready to win and are hitting those greens, you know that you've passed that group of athletes on in a good place to the technical, tactical coaches so that they're not going to be breaking down. So all you're doing is layering the sport on top of what you've helped them to build. Okay. So then you set out your scores based off the research, right? So I have the calf function test, the hamstring capacity test, the groin squeeze, hip internal rotation, limb symmetry index. These are all based off published research. So there's validity to this testing, right? It's not something that I'm pulling from my arse, okay? These are all coming from published peer-reviewed research papers, right? So we can see that these are the ready to win, ready to compete, ready to train. These are this fella's scores, right? And it gives him a total score out of 18. So his total score is a 14 out of 18, okay? 18 out of 18 would be optimal, but then it gives him his priorities. So we bring him down here. We know that his squat jump was better than his counter movement jump, so he needs priority number 1 to develop his stretch shortening cycle. He needs to do that. We know that his groin squeeze wasn't bad, right? But he was in the ready to compete area, right? We know that his calf function wasn't bad, but it was in the middle end area. So we're asking him to develop the groin squeeze and the lower limb symmetry as well. So these are his priorities for his block of training or his next block. And I think feeding it back like that can be quite useful. So all you need to do there is use a snipping tool where you can cut pictures in and cut pictures out, design a template. Takes a little bit of work, right? But it's like everything else. Once you get it set up, I think the athletes appreciate it and the coach appreciate it as well, because it gives a very clear, objective reading of where someone needs to get to through the lens of ready to win, ready to compete, ready to train, and a traffic light system, right? Um, and like we talk about being really technical and around how we do this as well. This is so simple as well in your profiling. Just you could be talking about previous injuries. You could have a picture like this, um, printed out, and on the other side of it, you could ask for details, ask them to circle where they've had a previous injury and write their details down. So simple, so simple. So now all of a sudden you're looking at something, because as coaches, remember how we get information back is really important as well. So it's not just how we deliver to the athlete, but also what we get back from the athlete, right? So we say, all right, left hamstring strain, um, left Achilles issue, pelvic issue. Now we're starting to paint a picture here, and maybe we need to look at something a little bit deeper, because, and then you're looking for dates, and you see, right, this fella has, repeatedly had hamstring strains every February for the last 4 years. Then, your experience would tell you that, okay, he didn't have the level of capacity to tolerate the loads of preseason for the last 4 years. Are we creating an intervention to do something differently for the forthcoming year, or else the same thing is going to happen again? So it's really simple. Then, once we have our profile done, we decide how we're going to weight people in terms of our programming. So we're going to have X amount of people who might need a block of strength work. You're going to have some people who are going to need a block of hamstring capacity work. You're going to have some people who are going to need a block of hip internal rotation work. Then all you do is you group them, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the gym scenario. You could say, right at the end of training, when they're already fatigued, break them into their three groups: hip internal rotation, hamstring capacity, and groin squeeze. And you say, right, lads, I want you to do a shot of, you're going to do 3 sets of 30 seconds, both legs, Copenhagen squeezes. You're going to do 5x5 Nordics. And ye lads over there, you're going to be just doing some hip internal rotation mobility work. And now all of a sudden you're dosing them and weighting them based off the results of their profile, and you're making an intervention, right, that is going to affect that athlete there and then based off the lowest hanging fruit. Okay. So that was our introduction to profiling. From next week on, I'm going to go deeper into the different types of profiles, right? And more where the rubber meets the road in terms of the interventions we can make based off the results of those individual profiles.